topics, not just because they are new, they are controversial, but they have not been really done before. These are so new. Some of the material that we introduced on Wednesday were only a few weeks old. And that's why we want to get this out in the public sphere, and that's why we chose Hong Kong as a place, as a springboard to get this, not only so you can hear it, but also we're filming it so it'll immediately go up onto YouTube. Because we want Muslims all over the world to hear this new material. More than that, we want to make sure that we do debate this material. Because it's so new, that's why the Muslims did not want to debate it. And even in England, I know that many of the Muslims who are probably watching this from England, they have been sending emails to the Muslims here in Hong Kong on how to try to confront these ideas, especially the material that I'm going to introduce today. What we did on Wednesday is probably, I feel, the Achilles heel of Islam. We really did confront the Quran historically. And this is what every religion has to do. Every religion requires, if it makes a religious claim, as both Islam and Christianity do, so do the Sikhs, so do the Buddhists, so do the Hindus, so do the humanists and the atheists. We all make historical claims. When you make a historical claims, you have to investigate it. You have to look at names, dates, places, and events. Those are the 4 historical areas that you have to investigate. So far, the Bible has only been investigated in those 4 areas. We have had almost 100 to 150 years of investigation on the Bible itself. Redacted criticism, source criticism, historical criticism, literary criticism, the documentary hypothesis. These are well-known criticisms that have been around since the 1800s. The Quran, for the first time, is going under that kind of scrutiny. That was the material that we introduced on Wednesday night. And the Muslims did not want to debate it. Very few Muslims showed up. That's okay. This is going up now so that thousands and millions of Muslims can now see it. But what we're saying to Muslims is don't stop there. Listen to these criticisms, take them on board, go back and ask and try to find out if you can find any answers to these criticisms like we have as Christians. We have found answers to everything about our Bible. We have been able now, we pretty well know the source criticism. We know how to answer the redacted criticism. The documentary hypothesis is not even being taught because we have responded to every one of those criticisms because when the Bible does talk about history, when it talks about a certain person doing a certain thing at a certain place at a certain time, in every case the Bible has been proven to be correct. So much so that today there is not one artifact, there is not one mural, there is not one stela, there is not one obelisk, there is not one tablet anywhere in the world that we can find that controverts a properly understood biblical statement. Let me repeat that. Today, there is not one piece of historical artifact anywhere in the world that controverts a properly understood biblical statement. And the Bible is the only book of history that can make that claim. So now we're taming the tables and we're now asking the same of Islam. And that's my area of expertise. I'm an Islamicist. Some of the material that we're introducing tonight comes out of my doctoral thesis, but much of it I have nothing to do with. Most everything I'm going to introduce tonight, I have nothing to do with. And what you're going to see tonight, this is not a Christian polemic. This is not a Christian attack against Islam. This is a historical polemic. That's what we call it, a historical critique. This is the same critique that must be done on the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Granth Sahib, you name it. Any religious text or any religious edifice should have this critique done to it. Christianity is way ahead of the rest of the world. That's why it makes my job so much easier. I didn't have this kind of material 35 years ago when I started working in the Islamic world. I didn't have what I'm going to show you today, nor what we showed you on Wednesday night. This never was available to me when I started this whole endeavor of working in Islam. That's why we want to make sure that this is not only offered to you here in Hong Kong, that everyone, and I'm talking to people who are watching this, all of you can now use this material and Muslims engage with it. So have many debates on it. Maybe this will be the beginning of many new enterprises, but what we're really hoping is that Muslims take on board the implications of what we're doing today, and I will talk about those implications as we move on. So let's go ahead and let's get into this talk today. What do Muslims claim about themselves? Well, they would say that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet. I don't think any Muslim would decry that. They would assume, whether they are conservative, nominal, liberal, they would all agree that Muhammad is the last prophet, the greatest prophet, the seal of all the prophets. They would say the Quran was his revelation, sent down only to him, and is the finest and greatest revelation, that he received it over a period of 23 years from 610 to 622, and that then was compiled completely at the time of Uthman, about roughly 20 years after he died, and that it's never changed. And that Islam as a religion is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings, the Sunnah, and on the Quran's teaching. So it's based on the Book of the Man, the Book of the Man, the Book of the Man. I've said this many times this week. That's their claims. Conclusion is, Islam is completely dependent, therefore, on one book modeled by one man. And we as Christians would say much the same thing. We are also modeled on a bigger book, modeled by a bigger man, the Bible in Jesus Christ. Therefore, since it's modeled by one book and one man, we need to investigate that man, and we need to investigate that book, and see indeed if Muslims are correct. Now, what is the classical account concerning Muhammad? What we have known about Muhammad is that he was born in 570 AD. No one has ever disputed that. And this is the classical account. This is the account you're going to hear in every school, has been everywhere you go. This is what I have been taught. And for 35 years, I've always assumed this is correct. Born in 570 to a mother named Amina. His father had already died, Abdullah. And so there he was born to a widow. In 610, he was up in the Hira cave, and he suddenly, an individual, he didn't know who it was at the time, appeared to him and said, Akka, that means recite. And his response was, Ma'aka, I cannot recite. That happened in 610 in the Hira cave. He came back and told his wife what had happened. She gave him 3 different tests to see if he was telling the truth. And after he passed all 3 of those tests, she then took him to her cousin named Waraka ibn Nawfal. He wanted to hear the story. He was a Nestorian Christian. Isn't that one of the ironies of history? And he said, truly, are you a prophet for what you have just referred to me? And that's why it was a Nestorian Christian who actually gave Muhammad his authority as a prophet. That happened in 610. From 610 to 622 then, Muhammad started receiving what we know as the Meccan revelations, or the Meccan surahs. These are the second half, or the latter half of the Quran. In 621, he gets woken up in the middle of the night, and he's told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, and he flies from Mecca up to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem he then goes up the 7 heavens to meet with Allah, who tells him to pray 50 times a day. Comes down to the 5th heaven. Muhammad then bumps into Moses, and Moses says, see if you can get it down. So he goes back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, getting down the prayers from 50 to 45 to 40, 35, 20, 15, finally down to 5 prayers. Once he gets it to 5 prayers, Moses says, that's fine, go on back down to earth. So he comes back down to Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is now built, and then he flies back down to Mecca in 621, known as the Miraj. And that is the story that is accounted, that is referred to by Muslims today, and that is why they believe the Dome of the Rock was built, to commemorate that event, 621. In 622, then he goes with about anywhere from 80 to 200 of his disciples. We don't know for sure because there are many different contradictions concerning the exact number. He goes with these disciples, and he then goes and moves up to Medina. That's known as the Hijrah. The Hijrah means the Exodus. So he goes and takes this Exodus from Mecca to Medina. And then from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, he receives the Medinan revelations. He's now living in Medina. That's why it's given its name, referring to the city he lived in. That's the first half of the Quran. That's the Medinan revelation. In 630, he then marches down, walks right into Mecca, and takes it over without firing a shot. He took it over peacefully. That happened in 630, and then in 632 he died. Possibly by poisoning, we don't know. At that time, the Quran had not been written down in a complete form. It had been memorized by many of the followers of Muhammad. Parts of it was written on stones and bones and pieces of bark, but it had not been written as a codified text. So this book that I have in my hand here was not written down in this form in 632 when Muhammad died. And that we saw very clearly when we unpacked it on Wednesday night. Abu Bakr then takes over control as the first caliph from 622 to 634. During his reign, the Quran was first written down by Zayd ibn Thabit. That happens between 632 and 634. He dies peacefully, and Umar takes over, and he reigns from 634 to 644. The next 10 years, he is killed. And then Uthman takes over, and from 644 to 656, for the next 12 years, the second recension, or this Quran supposedly was written down. This is known as the Uthmanic recension. We pretty well dispelled that on Wednesday. This is not the Uthmanic recension. This is only 93 years old. This is the Al-Azhar text, the Hafs text, as well known, created just 93 years ago in 624. Then in 655 to 656, when Uthman was killed, and so Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, then takes over from 656 to 661. The last 5 years, he only lasts for 5 years, and then he is killed by Muawiyah and the Umayyad Caliphate. Now that is known as the classical account. That's what we all have been told. There may be some variations. I've left an awful lot out. I've just given you the bare skeleton of what we know as the classical account. Is it true? Can you prove that this is true? How would you want to prove that this is true? Maybe that's the better question. Well, I would suppose and I would hope that somebody was there to see these events. Someone actually knew Muhammad, wrote about these events, wouldn't you? Yet everything I have just told you in the last 10 minutes, referring to all that you see up here on the screen, all of it, though it took place in this part, in this red area, none of it was written down in that time. None of this was written down during the time of Muhammad at all. None of it was written down in the same century as Muhammad. None of it was written down during this period, or this period, or this period. In order to find out everything I have just told you, in order to find out where these stories come from, you need to go to this period. And the first person to write down the story of Muhammad is named Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq died in 765, right here. We don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material. Doesn't exist today. There's nothing extant from Ibn Ishaq. We're only told about it by this man here, Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham dies in 833, so he dies in the 9th century. Everything we know about Muhammad, what he did, what he was doing in Medina, what he was doing in Mecca, all these stories that we've just talked about, the entire classical account about who Muhammad was and how Islam began, is first written down in the 9th century. Muhammad died in the 7th century. Do you have a problem with that? You should all be saying in your head, yes. We all have a problem with that. I have a problem with that. What about Muhammad's sayings? Because that's even more prolific. If you want to go to Muhammad's sayings, you need to go to this man here, Al-Bukhari. He dies in 870. He's the first to write down what Muhammad said. He was given 600,000 of these sayings. He then whittled them down and threw out 98% of them, only retained around 7,400. That means only retained 2% of it throughout the other 98%, and that's what we have today as the Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Bukhari, the most authoritative, it's called Sahih. That means it is perfect without error. But take a look when it was written down. It was written around way over here in the late 9th century. That's 240 years after Muhammad's death. If you want to get other hadith, like Sahih Muslim or Ibn Dawud or Ibn Tirmidhi, they all come after Al-Bukhari. Al-Bukhari is the first. If you want to talk about the tafsir, which would be the commentaries on this book, you need to go to Al-Tabari. And Al-Tabari is right here. He died in 923. That's the 10th century. That's 300 years later. Now, there are many other tafsir that come after him, but not before him. He is the first to write down the commentaries and also the history, the tahqiq, all of these begin with al-Tabari. Badawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, many who come after, but none of them come before al-Tabari. So basically everything we're looking at here, everything that happens here, doesn't get written down till here. Roughly 200 to 300 years later. Now, if you look at the Bible, we know when Jesus dies in 33 AD. When he dies in 33 AD, we almost have immediately Paul's letters. Within 15 years of Christ's death, Paul begins to write his letters. So he was writing in the same century. He was also writing the same time that Jesus lived, though he never knew Jesus. But then you start getting the gospel accounts. We have Matthew, Mark, and Luke written within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death, at the latest 40 years of Christ's death. And then you have the Gospel of John written in the late first century, about 92 AD. So you have that within 60 years of Christ's death. 2 of those 4 gospel writers actually knew Jesus Christ. They actually saw Jesus Christ. They actually lived with Jesus Christ for 3 years. John and Matthew spent the last 3 years of his life with them. So these are eyewitness accounts. The other 2 got it from the eyewitnesses. And that's why we can trust them, because of the fact that so much of what they wrote, they actually participated in. All of the New Testament, including his life and his sayings, were written within the first century, within 60 years of Christ's death. When you do a comparison, when you look at how Christianity began and who began it, and about the life of Jesus himself, that's written within 15 to 60 years of Christ's death. When you look at Islam and Muhammad and how he began and what he did and how Islam began, that's written within 200 to 300 years later, which is more authoritative. And that's why we're asking this question today. If we were dependent on knowing who Jesus is, using the same criteria that Islam is dependent on, we would know nothing about Jesus Christ till the 3rd century. How could we defend him? How could we support him? How could we say we knew anything he did or anything he said? None of us could. And yet Muslims have not talked about this. This is the elephant in the room that Muslims don't want to talk about. Everything they know about Muhammad comes from 200 to 300 years later. Now, for 21st century scholars legitimately and rightly so are concerned about this. And they're saying Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Their conclusion, the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, that's very important, his name's going to come up again today, and before, is a later fabrication. You can see now why they're saying this. As historians, there is a real problem they're having. Here are the problems. If so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, then why did it take so long to write it down? Well, Muslims have always come back to me and said, well, they're not literate. That's why they didn't write it down. Well, no, they claim Muhammad was not literate, but you cannot tell me that the Muslims did not know how to read and write. We know that by 661, they had controlled all of North Africa, going over the west and all the way over to India. And by 652, they controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Are you saying no one could write in Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo in the 7th century? What are you going to do with the beautiful library that was in Alexandria that was burned to the ground in the 5th century? What about Zayd ibn Thabit, the secretary of Muhammad? He was a secretary. What do secretaries do? They write. Otherwise, what's their purpose? So you cannot tell me people could not read or write then. Maybe Muhammad did read or write, but everybody around him read and wrote. Where did the 9th century biographers, therefore, get their material from? If they were not living at that time, if they were living hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later, how did they know what really happened? And where did their material come from? Now, Muslims will tell you that they come from what they call isnad. So before every akhbar, there's a list of names. So-and-so who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the Prophet himself. The problem with every one of those so-and-sos, they never wrote down anything that they said or that they sent on. So therefore, we have no idea whether or not any of the names which are attributed to those saints are true. And basically what we're looking at is a religion based on oral tradition. Now, I don't trust oral tradition. If I tell this gentleman something, he tells him, he tells him, he tells him. By the time he gets over to this woman over here, what I've told him and what she tells me are probably two different things. We play Chinese whisper. Sorry if that's, I hope that's not offensive, but that's what we do as birthday parties or telephone. It's a very fun game to play. And within a matter of 15 minutes, the story gets changed. Can you imagine if that story goes for 200 years, how it would get changed and how it would get embellished? Can you see the difficulty? That's the problem of oral tradition. If nothing is written down, then how do we know whether any of the so-and-sos, what they said, is correct? Therefore, since we have to wait 200 to 300 years, should we go to the period these events took place? Let's go back to the 7th century and see what we find. And this is what they're finding. That's what we're going to unpack today. Now let's take a look at the map so you know what we're talking about. This is a part of the world that, about 661, this is a part of the world that they control. They quickly went then off right across North Africa, destroyed the church as they went, and they went and took over Andalusia, which is today Spain. The other way, they were moving this direction over here towards the Persian world, all the way into what then became the Mughal Empire, and of course India and Pakistan, and then further afield, Bangladesh today. So that whole swath of land soon became under their control by the late 7th century. Now, the people that I'm going to be using for this material, this is not my material. Let me repeat that again. This is not my material. I am nothing more than a messenger. I am nothing more than the one who communicates it to you. I am not capable of doing this kind of research. You'll see why. But the ones who have done this research, people like Dr. John Wansberg, he was the first one that taught me this material. He was head of department at School of Oriental and African Study in the University of London when I started taking these courses in 2004. I'm sorry, 1994. Let's get my dates right. Boy, I'm much older than I realized. 1994. My goodness, I feel old. That's 23 years ago that I started. For 23 years, I've been working with this material. And he was the one that first opened me up to it. And he was the one that was amazing because he was taking what everybody else was saying and was putting it into layman's terminology. That's not, I got the wrong person. That's the next man, Hawting. Dr. Wansborough is the one that was in charge and responsible there at School of Oriental and African Studies. He's the one that wrote two books called Quranic Studies and Sectarian Milieu. These two books in 1977 and 1978 basically blew open this whole problem. And he was the first one to actually look at the Quran literalistically and say, we've got a real problem. This book has a lot of stories that would not have made any sense that early. These could only have been written at a much later date. Dr. Gerald Hawting is the one that taught me. Gerald Hawting, I credit with much of the material that I have today because he got me interested in it. And that's why I've been working with this material for almost 25 years. Dr. Patricia Kroner, I got to know her. She was my supervisor when I began my doctorate back in the 1990s, my first doctorate, and she said, and she was working there in Oxford University to begin with, and then she wrote a book in 1975 called Hagerism. She got death threats for that book, and so she moved from Oxford over to Cambridge, and that's where I got to know her. And when I did my first debate on this material in 1995, that's 22 years ago, I did my first debate on this material. In 1995, I went up to her, and she was the one that, yes, said, help me put that debate together. Dr. Patricia Krohn reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic languages. These are not modern languages. These are, many of them are unknown today. She is one of the few in the world that can read and write in all 15 languages. She is from Denmark. She has just died. She died a year ago. But there's nobody that can equal her anywhere in the world. And that's why she's so dangerous, because she goes back to the original texts. She goes back to the original writing. She's a linguist. Dr. Andrew Rippin, from Calgary, he just died a few months ago. He was also a good man. What he did is he took all this very academic material and brought it into layman's terminology. So when you read his material, it's much easier to read. Out of Calgary in Canada. Dr. Robert Hoyland, out of Oxford University. He reads and writes 18 languages. I got to know him when he was at Cambridge University, and it was amazing to see what he could do and what he could find. And he was the one that probably took all the surrounding material that was happening in the 7th and 8th century and put it into a book called Islam as Others See It. Dr. Yehuda Nevo out of Jerusalem. Crossroads to Islam was the one that actually went back to the earliest inscriptions and actually translated their inscriptions so we could read them today, showing what kind of documentation material we had in the 7th and 8th century. And then from Germany, we have Dr. Gunther Lulling, Dr. Gerd Quinn, Dr. von Bothmer, and Dr. Oleg. These 4 major scholars, these are probably the most authoritative scholars when it comes to the Arabic material and also the Syriac material. That's why they've been so valuable. But these have not been bettered. You're getting the best scholars in the world here who have been working on this material. So I'm offering you the best. Every one of these men are at the top of their field, and women. But then there have been 2 books that have come out to try to unpack all their right, because these are academics. And as you well know, academics are hopeless communicators. They have an awful lot up here, but they're not good at communicating what they have. They're boring as ever to listen to, and they don't even understand how to popularize it so the rest of us can understand it. Dr. Patricia Coronel is well known for writing essay after essay, where she writes and she keeps her quotations in the original language, which none of us can understand. So you need people like Dr. Tom Holland. Dr. Tom Holland is a literary major from Cambridge University, and he was the first one to take this material and popularize it in a book called In the Shadow of the Sword. If you have a chance, go get the book. It was published in 2012. Taking much of this very difficult academic material and putting it into layman's terminology. He then put together a documentary called Islam, the Untold Story. It was shown on Channel 4 News, Channel 4 Television in Britain on August 28, 2012 at 9 p.m., taking everything he could in that book and putting it into a 90-minute documentary. Now, of course, he had to go very quick and very shallow into much of it, and he came to no conclusions, purposely did not want to come to any conclusions. Yet because of that filming, when they wanted to redo that filming, when they wanted to show it a second time in November of the same year, there's so many Muslims protested against that movie that they've never shown it a second time. That's how damaging that documentary is. You cannot watch that documentary here in Hong Kong. But I've got it on my computer. If any of you want it, just ask me, I'll give it to you. You can watch it tonight. You need to watch the video, you need to look at the documentary, because this is the material I think is the most damaging for Islam, historically. But then there's been some other material that's come out by this man here. Dr. Dan Gibson is an archaeologist. You might say he is Indiana Jones of today. His father was an archaeologist, his grandfather was an archaeologist. He spent 25 years living in the Middle East, living amongst the Bedouin, learning the languages, went to as many places as he could find in this book, in the Quran. He wanted to find it and physically go there. And so he spent from 1979 to 2004 learning to walk where he thought Muhammad had walked. The only problem is, and you'll see later, he found an awful lot of difficulty. But we're going to introduce 2 of his books, one called 2 books and 1 documentary, one called Chronological Geography, which came out in 2011, a documentary called The Sacred City came out in May 2016, and then this book. This book has just come out. If you get a chance, get it. Early Islamic Qiblas just came out in May of this year. This is probably the most damaging book right here. This is a culmination of 25 years of research. It's only been out for 4 months, and we're going to be introducing some of his findings from that book tonight. And what he asks is really, did Islam actually begin as Muslims have told us? Is there a city of Mecca? Was that the original holy city? Did the Qibla originally face Mecca? And what about all the geographical incongruities in the Quran itself? Now, I'm going to give you their conclusions before I even show you how they came to them. So let's start with their conclusions. These are the conclusions these scholars have found. First of all, they say that the first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad does not exist until 691. We know nothing about Muhammad's name from any Muslim sources. Ooh, did I say Muslim? From any Arab sources. There is no reference to Muhammad in any Arab sources prior to 691. The first reference to people called Muslims is not till the 690s. Remember, Muhammad died in 632. That means 60 years after Muhammad died, there is no Arab sources, literary, inscription on buildings that refers to his name. The first reference to religion called Islam is not till 691, and it is first introduced on the Dome of the Rock there in Jerusalem. The first reference to Mecca, the city of Mecca, is not till 741. Think that through. Muhammad died there supposedly, or in Medina, had been living in Mecca, died in Medina in 632. There is no reference to that city anywhere in the century that he lived. And the first biography of Muhammad, as you've already heard, within Islamic sources is not till 833. So what did these people call themselves if they didn't call themselves Muslims? From all the sources we can find, there were Arabs there. They did exist. They were conquering these cities. But they never called themselves Muslims. They called themselves Saracens. They called themselves Hagarines because they're in the line of Hagar. They called themselves Ishmaelites because they're in the line of Ishmael. They called themselves Maghreb because they're from the Maghreb. And they called themselves Mahajurun. That means people of the Hijrah, people of the Exodus. They were nomadic. They were moving from one place to another. That's why they use those terms. But nowhere in any of their documentation do we find them referring to themselves as Muslims. So let's go to the first problem. And the first problem is geography itself. When you read the Quran, there are 65 geographical names or geographical places that are referred to in this book. But we find over and over again, 9 places are named, 9 different places are named. We know of 23 references to the people from Ad, which is the biblical Uz. We have 24 references to the people from Thamud, which is the other name for the Nabateans. They cut dwellings into mountains, things like that. We have 7 references to the people from Midian. So therefore, these people from Ad, Thamud, and Midian must be pretty important if they're having this much contact with this prophet. But there's no reference in any of this to a place called Mecca. Yet take a look and see where Ad, Thamud, and Midian are. The people from Ad, Thamud, and Midian are way up here. Mecca's way down here. There's 600 miles between these two. Unless this prophet, you notice I'm saying this prophet, because in the Quran you will only find Muhammad's name 4 times. In the Arabic, in the English, he's been added there every time. Every time it says the prophet, or the representative of God, or the Nabi of Allah, it's always in parentheses Muhammad. That's the reference, that's the inference. That's later Muslims have put that name in. But not in the Arabic. He's not there in the Arabic except 4 times. How many times is Jesus named in the Quran? 93 times. Which supposes that Jesus is more important than Muhammad, even in the Quran, if you want to go by number of times that he's referred to. Now, when you look at the 65 references, geographical references, we find that almost in every case, the 9 names are placed every time they do not fit Mecca. 600 miles too far north. Let's take a look at the Gospel of Luke, probably the most historical reference because Luke was a doctor, medical doctor, and that's why he filled his pages with names of dates, places, events. When you look at the 110 geographical references in the Gospel of Luke, you will find he talks about 31 places named outright. In every case, all of them were correct. The right place, the right time, in the right area. Now, let's go to Mecca, and this is where you can really see the problem. How many times is Mecca referred to in this book? Once. Surah 48, Ayah 24. That's it. If it's such an important city, why is there only one reference to it? We do know that quite a bit about Mecca. We know if you look at the traditions and if you look at the Quran, when you look at the traditions, you will see that Mecca was the first sanctuary appointed. It doesn't say Mecca, it just says this first sanctuary appointed to mankind was that at Mecca, Surah 3, Ayah 96. It assumes that the place of the prophet is the mother of all settlements, that it is where Adam and Eve were thrown down to. It is where Mecca, is where Abraham lived in 1900 BC, according to Surah 21, but it doesn't say the word Mecca. It just says this place of the prophet. So therefore, it's a pretty important place, though it never gives it a name. It just says the place of the prophet. In Surah 7, Ayah 24, Adam and Eve are thrown down to earth. According to the later traditions from the 9th and 10th century, they refer to that as Mecca, but not in the Quran. Abraham supposedly lived there because that's where the Kaaba is, but it doesn't call it to the name, and that's we know in Surah 21. I had no idea Abraham lived that far south. I thought Abraham lived way up in Canaan and Mesopotamia. It's where Muhammad was supposedly born and lived until 622, but it doesn't give it a name. And Mecca became the center of the Qibla in 624, but it doesn't say Mecca. Even in Surah 2, ayah 145 to 149. The only reference we have in Surah 48, ayah 24. Why is it only referred to once if it is so important? If it is the earliest settlement in the history of mankind, if it is where Abraham went to rebuild the Kaaba, if it was a center of trade north, south, east, or west, if it is where Muhammad himself supposedly was born and grew up, then why don't they name the name? When you look at the traditions, you notice that this place where the prophet is from, that it's in a valley, it has a parallel valley, that has a stream going through it, it has a pillar of salt, it has fields, it has trees, it has grass, it has fruit, it has loam, it has olive trees, and it has a mountain overlooking the Kaaba. None of these things fit Mecca. Mecca is not in a valley. It does not have a parallel valley, it does not have a stream going through it, it does not have a pillar of salt. If this was Lot's wife, that is way too far south. That's about 600 miles too far south. It does not have fields, trees, grass, fruit, loam. It does not have olive trees. There are no olive trees anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula. The only olive trees that exist are in the Mediterranean, 600 miles further north. Olive trees have never existed that far south. Now take a look at this map here. This is a 7th century Byzantine map. What's missing? Right there. That's where Mecca is located today. It's not on this map. Here's a 7th century Arab trade route, and you can see where the Arab trade route goes. All the trade routes come here from the Silk Road. They all come to this area. They come along here, the Northern Plateau. This is the Northern Plateau, but they miss completely Mecca. When you look at official maps, you'll see this is a 6th century map. Mecca is not there. Doesn't exist on that map. Here's a 7th century map. This is the time Muhammad was living. There is no place called Mecca anywhere up the eastern coast, the western coast, sorry. Mecca still doesn't exist. And this is what has really puzzled cartographers, because anybody should, every map should have Mecca if it's that important a city. If it's the oldest city in the history of mankind, if it's where Abraham lived, if it was a center of trade north, south, east, and west, why is it not on any map? Here's another 7th century map. Still missing. Yet another century map. Non-existent. Now this is a map looking back, done in the 20th century, looking back as to what Muslims thought. This is what map that Muslims have put together, saying that this is where Mecca exists. Dr. Patricia Corona looked at this map, and she saw that there was a problem with it. We do know that Mecca supposedly got its importance because it became the center of trade. That's why it was so important. North, south, east, and west. And that's why Muhammad became important, because he was a trader himself. And she looked at this map here, and you can see here in Aden is where the trade route starts. It follows that green line, goes up along the western plateau. When it gets to Taif, suddenly goes down off the plateau, comes down to Mecca. That's over 1,000 meters down. Way too far down. Then it has to come back up and get up back onto the plateau to get up to Yathrib and the Khaybar, Tabuk, and then on up to Gaza in the north. That's known as the Western Trade Route along the plateau. When she looked at that, she says, hold on a minute. Why is this detour down to Mecca and back up to Yathrib, from Taif down to Mecca and back up to Yathrib? She was told that that's because they controlled the trade. That's why it had to come to Mecca. So she decided to go investigate this. Now remember, this woman reads and writes 15 languages, so she can go back and look at all the original documents. So she went to all the original documents from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, went up to all the trading documents, went to documents that were written over here in India, documents that were written up here in Ctesiphon, which they later became Baghdad. She went in documents that were written of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. That's the Christian Empire, and then that's the Persian Empire. And she noticed that in the 5th and 6th century, these two empires started battling each other, the Persians and the Byzantines. And as they battled each other, that shut down the Persian Gulf. The trade used to come from the western coast of India up the Persian Gulf. That means the trade had to be rerouted over here to Aden. Now, Montgomery Watt is the one that came up with the theory, that's why Mecca became important, because the trade was redirected down here and went up the western plateau, and they controlled the trade all the way up along the western plateau. Now, my 10-year-old son looked at this map, and he found a problem with that theory. Do any of you find a problem with that theory, looking at that map? Patricia Crone solved the problem of this theory real quickly. Let's see if you're as good as my 10-year-old son. Anybody want to venture a guess? No? This is a water, right? That's the Arabian Sea. You go up the Persian Sea, you can't go there, therefore you come this way. Why would you go along land 1,250 miles when you have a waterway right here? Why in the world did they take off the goods off the boat? Patricia Crone found that if you only go 50 miles by land, that's the same price as going 1,250 miles by sea. It is prohibitively expensive to go by land. Why? Because you have to protect the good. You have to preserve the goods. You have to have camels to carry them. You have to feed the camels. You have to have places to sequester them. You have to live in oases. You have to pay taxes. And you have to make sure that no robbers come and rob you. Therefore, you have to secure them. That's why it's so expensive. That's why everything has been done by sea. Even today, when you get all your cars, they come, well, I used to say it's in America from China. Now I can't say it because you're in China. But from Japan, they have to come by sea. They don't come overland. Why? Because it is the cheapest way to send large amounts of goods. It has always been the cheapest, even in the 21st century. Therefore, why in the world, she asked, would they take their ships down this direction, take them off here in Aden, go up through Najran, Sana, up to Taif, down to Mecca, up to Yathrib, Qibla, Tabuk, and on up to Gaza? It made no logical sense. So, being a linguist, she went back to all the original documents, and she read them, the first, and the second, and the third. She read them in Assyrian, she read them in Nabatean. She read all of the original documents, and she found that there was no trade whatsoever going up the Arabian Peninsula. It was all maritime. Every bit of it was maritime. And it was not the Arabs who were in charge of it, it was the Eritreans over here. It was Agilus. Agilus is a city right here. That's where the Eritreans live today. Those are the people that control the trade. Their names are all over the western coast of India. And she destroyed the trade route with just one book that she wrote in 1987. Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. Read it. Chapter by chapter by chapter, she completely deconstructed the trade route. That's why she got her death threat. So then she decided, after looking at all this documentation, she wanted to find out when was the first time that Mecca is referred in any documentation. She scoured every text she could find. She even found references up here in Stesafon, where they came across the deserts over to Yathrib right here, which later became Medina. And she found that in Yathrib they had silver mines, and they talked about the silver mine, and they talked about Taif, and they talked about Najran, and they talked about Tabuk and Qibla, but they don't refer to Mecca once. No reference to Mecca in any of their documentation. Yet this is supposed to be the center of trade, the oldest city of mankind. Guess when she found the first reference to Mecca in any documentation? It was on the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius Continuato Byzantia Arabica, written in 741. Muhammad died in 632. Was born in 570, supposedly in the city that no one had heard about before. And for over 100 years after Muhammad's death, there is no reference to this city at all. The first map that you will see Mecca finally displayed on it is not till 900 AD. That's the 10th century. Now, why have Muslims not told us this before? Let's look at modern Mecca today. Today, they have one of the largest, tallest buildings in the world, the fourth tallest in the world right there now, looking right over the Kaaba. It's the clock tower. About 6 or 7 buildings have been around it. And they want now that to be the center of time. They want to make it Meccan Mean Time, to take it from Greenwich Mean Time. And they model it very much on Big Ben from London itself. When you look at the future, this is what Mecca is going to look like. It's going to be all cemented over. Enormous structures, 62 different tall buildings, enormous buildings, skyscrapers are going to be surrounding the Kaaba. And when you do build buildings that tall, what do? Well, when you build buildings that tall, you got to build deep foundations, do you not? And when you build deep foundations, you have to dig into the soil. And when you dig in the soil in any major city, anywhere in the world, archaeologists come. And why do archaeologists come? Because they want to see what artifacts you dig up. If you dig up any building in Jerusalem or in Amman or even possibly even here in Hong Kong, when the further you dig, the more you come across artifacts, because those are residue from former civilizations. So the archaeologists have come, and you can see they're digging it all up. And what have they found? Absolutely nothing. Mecca has no history. There are no artifacts to find. There is no museum of any archaic residue in Mecca today. Can you see why this is such an embarrassment? And that's why now, I would assume that they are now cementing everything over. They want to make sure that nobody does any investigation there anymore, because there's nothing to find. If Mecca did not exist prior to the 8th century, then you need to ask, what are we going to do with the Qibla? Problem number 3. And here's where the real rubber hits the fan. This is where the most damaging material I'm going to introduce now. And this is the material that now has caused Muslims lots of anger. And that's why we don't see many Muslims here today. They were told not to come here. Let's now move in to see what we're finding. If you're looking at the Kaaba, you need to ask about the Qibla. The Qibla is the direction of prayer. Every Muslim knows anywhere in the world that they are to pray towards Mecca. And they're given all kinds of accoutrement. When many mosques will have these mihrabs, they're positions into the wall that show you where Mecca is in every mosque around the world. When I was in Kuala Lumpur, there in my hotel room, I always had the Qibla pointing to me so I could know where I wanted to pray if I wanted to pray towards Mecca. You have now on your app phones, you can get it on your smartphones where the Qibla is. So today, every Muslim knows where Mecca is. There's no excuse not to know where Mecca is. And why? Because in Surah 2, ayah 143 to 145, the direction of prayer is then dictated that it must be redirected from Jerusalem back down, but it doesn't say Mecca, just to the holy place. They have put Mecca there in the parentheses. So everybody has assumed that from 624 on, every Qibla and every mosque should be facing Mecca, right? Because there were no mosques before that time. Islam really did not begin until the Caliphate began, and that's in 624. So every mosque that would have been built would have been after 624. Archaeology supports this challenge. Not from Jerusalem to Mecca, as Muslims suggest, but from some place further north. When back in 1905, 2 researchers in the Middle East, Dr. Feherbadi and Dr. Creswell, were going around that part of the world. It was still open. They had not closed it to foreigners. And they were looking, and they were trying to find the earliest mosque that they could find. And they found the mosque in Fustat, which is outside of Cairo, the garrison town, built in 641. That mosque was facing straight east. When they went to what is today Iraq, they went to the Wasit Mosque, built in 706, and that mosque, Qibla, was facing west. When they went to the Kufa Mosque, which is also in Iraq, that mosque was also facing west. So this is what they found. This mosque over here in Egypt was facing this direction, but it should have been facing this direction. These 2 mosques that are now in Iraq today were facing this direction, but it should have been facing this direction. They all thought that therefore they must have been facing Jerusalem.